Well, Professor Karin Costa Vazquez is an economist at the Center for China and Globalisation at the O.P. Jindal Global University in India. Professor, good afternoon to you, our time, and thank you for your time. Brazil is a lot like South Africa. It's got very high inequality, huge problems growing its economy, a very diverse country. Do you expect Lula to change the country's direction after Bolsonaro's rightward term in office?
Thank you very much, Stephen, for having me on the show. I think you're right. And the situation is very difficult in Brazil in all fronts, economically, socially, environmentally. And ahead of him, Lula will have a very difficult task to overcome these challenges and gather rally support from all different spectrums of the political groups to support, to join him in this effort. So he will need the brightest minds and all the arms and efforts to rebuild this country after these last 4 years of disaster of Jair Bolsonaro's administration.
I mean, Bolsonaro, the best way to look at him really is a sort of Brazilian Donald Trump, I think, is maybe the best way to try and understand him. What damage do you think he's done to the country? He didn't even believe in COVID-19.
True. We had a reverse in virtually all the sustainable development goals of the United Nations within the UN Development Agenda, 2030 Development Agenda, being the most blatant one, the poverty rates and the hunger, that Brazil came back to the map of hunger in the world, which was actually one of the main achievements that the country had in the 2000s, and we were very proud of it, to have eradicated extreme hunger across the country. And now we are back, we are moving backwards. So in his inaugural speech, in this first speech after winning the elections, Lula was very vocal in putting ending hunger again as the top most important priority in his next administration.
Bolsonaro, obviously, as you say, hugely controversial. How do you think Beijing sees what's happening in Brazil at the moment? Brazil and China, as we are, both part of BRICS.
True. I believe that China and all countries, they see this as an opportunity to re-engage with Brazil, which over the past 4 years has been isolated from international arena, including in the BRICS grouping. Brazil did not leverage its potential within the bloc to exert its influence in international affairs. And so taking BRICS, for instance, as one of the opportunities to re-engage Brazil going forward in international affairs, and including with China, Lula has already stated that the grouping, that the bloc will be at the forefront of his foreign policy, and that his previous foreign policy suggests that issues, for example, like the proposal to expand the BRICS, which has been one of the priorities under Chinese presidency this year, will be on the top of the agenda and could be considered favorably by Lula's administration, for example. But there are some concerns on how, for instance, to reconcile BRICS expansion with issues like a consensus, decision-making within the bloc, issues like the balance between the 5 members within the bloc. So now, whether or not Lula will throw his weight behind BRICS expansion and other issues on BRICS and international affairs, I believe that his approach would certainly be a departure from the approach taken by Bolsonaro, which saw the bloc and international relations, including with China, strictly from a commercial economic angle, and in many cases neglected the role that Brazil can play in global agendas like climate, like health and security.
There's also, of course, within BRICS, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And as I understand what's happened at the United Nations, I think Brazil once or twice has actually voted to condemn Russia's actions. China has abstained. Of course, Russia has voted against it. South Africa has abstained. Does that put pressure? Is Lula likely to change Brazil's view on Russia's invasion of Ukraine in some way?
I believe that we are all in line that the world today needs cooperation. needs cooperation in health, in security, in climate, in energy, and that the solutions to some of these challenges, they do depend on the BRICS stewardship. And the BRICS, they have become a key development actor on its own right and now needs to show protagonism and work towards a more stable and a more peaceful environment for sustainable development going forward. So I think Lula will bring his ways and his charisma and of course his knowledge in foreign policy to be a bridge builder amongst these countries within the BRICS, and hopefully bring back development into the fore of the BRICS agenda in so many important issues that we need today in the world.
BRICS is supposed to be a sort of counterpoint to the West. That was sort of the idea, although the West, the whole idea of BRICS came from a Western economist. But the idea is that, it would sort of be a counterpoint. It would be a different way of seeing the world. It would be a group of countries that do things differently and particularly focus on sort of the global South. Is it really doing that? I mean, Saudi Arabia now thinking of applying for membership. I mean, do you think that BRICS is fulfilling that role of being a counterpoint to the West?
I think that in the first decade of existence, the BRICS were very successful in pushing for IMF and World Bank quota redistribution and the reform of Bretton Woods institutions. And also for this reason, and the creation of alternatives to international financial order, like, for instance, the creation of the new development bank and the contingency reserve agreement for the provision of infrastructure finance and liquidity to emerging and developing economies. So because of these achievements in the early days of the BRICS, the bloc was mainly perceived as a contestor or as an opponent to the West. But actually, I think perceptions are different depending on who is saying and who is reading, right? It could also be understood, for instance, as alternatives, as leading voices and interests of the global South, legitimate interests by different countries, emerging and developing economies of the global South, into how they can play a more active role in the international agenda. So I think this was very prominent, I believe, in this first phase of the BRICS until, let's say, 2015 with the creation of the NDB, which in a way slowed down a little bit in its second decade of existence, and mainly due to the domestic and foreign policy directions within many of the BRICS countries and the economic situation in Brazil and South Africa, Russia, which made more difficult for the 5 countries to play a more active, significant role in setting agendas and pushing reforms at the global level. We can also mention the India-China border dispute and the broader dispute competition in the Pacific, which have also challenged the balance within the bloc. And this has fueled certainly many questions and criticisms on the effectiveness and the impact of the BRICS. And I would dare to say that we are possibly entering a third stage now with countries like Saudi Arabia, as you mentioned, but also Argentina, Iran, Turkey, and we've heard other names as well, who have already expressed their intention to join the bloc. And that could be potentially signaling that multilateralism is here to stay, that we have a increasingly multipolar world, and there may be no way back.
Professor, thank you. Professor Karin Costa Vazquez is a professor at the O.P. Jindal Global University in India, an expert, as you can hear, on globalization, China and Brazil.